Welcome back. Today I wanted to talk about king and pawn endgames, but this time with the rook pawn. In the past, I have made a couple of videos about the king and pawn endgames with the pawn in the middle of the board, one of the files that's not on the edge. And we found out in those videos, and I found out by studying my endgame books and practicing against Stockfish or with the analysis board here on Lichess, that it makes a huge difference whether the king is in front of this pawn or behind it. Obviously, let's say we're playing with the white pieces. Now here it doesn't matter whose turn it is. White can force a win, and black can't. Black can't even force a draw here. But if our king was behind the pawn, black can force a draw here if they're careful, making just the precise moves, and it doesn't matter what we can do, or it doesn't matter what we do, black can force the draw. So that made a huge difference. It doesn't make a difference on the edge of the board. And one of the only reason that makes sense, and I think this is the reason, is that here we have a file on both sides of our pawn and on both sides of our kings. So here, when black moves to one side, because they can't move here, so their only legal moves are left or right. So when they move to left, we move to the right. Or backing up, if they move to the right, we move to the left. And our king cuts off all the squares that our pawn will need to promote. Now their king can't come back to that file. All it can do is move forward or sideways, and then our pawn is going to promote, and black can resign at this point. Unless they're hoping to get the draw by time. But on the edge of the board, which is the original position shown here, we can't force them to one side or the other. They only have one choice, but so do we. So when they move to one side of our pawn, we can't move to the other side. Even if our pawn is further back here, all black has to do is stay right here. It doesn't matter whose turn it is. If they move over and we get in front of our pawn, well, that doesn't help us here, because now our pawn can't move forward and they're just going to come back. We can't go to the other side. What we want is for when they go here to go to the other side, but there's no more files. Our king would fall off the board, and who knows what would happen then. So we have to move aside. If they move aside, if we decide to push our pawn here, black can just go back in front of it. We can't get back in front of it. And we can't stay next to our pawn unless we move it. But if we move our pawn, that's a stalemate. Our pawn cuts off this square and our king cuts off these. They don't have a legal move. It's a draw. If we didn't move our pawn, well, we have to move away from it then, or behind it. But if we move behind it, they're just going to come forward or move over. It doesn't matter. They can move over or come forward. And so if we move, say we move behind our pawn, they come forward. Well, now we can't even go back here. We have to go back here, or well, they can go back. If we come forward, they go to the side, and you end up with either a repetition of moves or a stalemate, or we move away from our pawn and then we can't come back to it, or we can come back this way, but stuck. Repetition. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind as we transition from the middle game into the end game. And so if you have a choice as you're transitioning, as you're trading off your last few pieces, as you're protecting pawns and trying to push them past the opponent's pawns to create a passed pawn, you will know ahead of time that there's a huge difference between the position here and the position here. And if you know that you can trade off an edge pawn to get a passed pawn on one of these center files, any of the files that aren't the edge, it makes a huge difference. Now, I found out there are some exceptions, and I don't remember exactly what they are, with the files that are right next to the edge. I might do that in a later video, but right now I want to focus on the fact that there's a huge difference between a pawn that's not on the edge and a pawn that is on the edge. And again, it doesn't matter which edge it is. The problem is that there's no file to the other side of the pawn for our king to move to when they move this way. So, because earlier in the game, you're going to have major pieces, you're going to have minor pieces, you're going to have a bunch of pawns able to break through. And so knowing this ahead of time, knowing that black can force the draw on the edge, and knowing that we can force the win in the middle, everything else is equal. Our king is in front of the pawn. Our king is in front of the pawn. Pawns on the 5th rank, pawns on the 5th rank. And enemy king's at the back. Either way, everything else, everything's the same except we're on the edge and don't have the choice of going left or right. We only have the choice of going left in this case. And over on the other side, obviously, if we were over here, we would only have the choice of going right. I also found out the hard way that even if their king doesn't get back there in time, black can force a draw. I had a position, and I don't remember exactly how it came about, but where black was able to get their king here, but not here. And I thought, I've done it. I've kept them out of the corner, because I had already studied this part, and I already knew that if black got to the corner, they could just move back and forth and force the draw, as I just showed. But then I realized, wait, I can't get out. I can't get my king out from in front of this pawn. So, and if I did, black moved here. Well, I can come back, but then I still have the same problem. I can't get out from in front of my pawn. And I don't remember exactly which way the game went from this point, but I do know that what happened here was that I ended up with my king trapped in front of my pawn and could not get out. And so we would just repeated moves. There was nothing I could do. And now it doesn't work. None of these positions make any difference if before we get that passed pawn on the edge, the rook pawn, if we're able to keep black's king from getting over there. So for example, here, if it's black's turn, they move, we move here, but we do not want to get there directly in front of our pawn on the same file. But as black tries to get there, we cut them off. Now our pawn can advance. And not only does our king guard those three squares, our king cuts off these. So the other king's path to our pawn is going to be a long way around, right? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 moves. Our pawn only needs 1, 2, 3 to get past that barrier. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but our pawn only needed 1, 2, 3, and it's no longer within reach of that king. By the time the king gets there, our pawn's already promoted. So it definitely depends on where the kings and pawns are at the beginning of the game. For example, if this is where it started, well, they're going to win our pawn before our king can even get there. And so it's not going to be a draw because we couldn't force the pawn through. It's going to be a draw by insufficient material. Even if we try to bring our king, they're going to come for our pawn. And now if we move our pawn, they're going to take it. If we move our king, they're going to get here. We can't get close enough, and it's going to be a draw by insufficient material. So it definitely depends on where everything starts out. The idea is to know this ahead of time, which is why we study these endgames, which is why I'm studying them. Because at some point in the game, it's not going to be an endgame yet. It's going to be a middle game with other pawns, pieces, heavy pieces, minor pieces. And it's going to be getting close to an endgame. We're going to be looking for creating a passed pawn. We're going to be looking for tactics to trade off the right pieces in the right ways so that we will create a passed pawn somewhere. And if obviously here we just win because the king can't catch it in time. But the whole idea is to know this ahead of time so that when we get there, we want to get in a situation like this if possible when it's black's turn. I mean, that would be awesome. But even if it's not, even if it's white's turn here, it shouldn't matter that much. Black has to go one way or the other. And so if we move to the side, if they move to the side, we're going to win this. It doesn't matter because our king's in front of the pawn. We studied this in the other video. What we don't want to end up with is a situation in which they're going to be able to reach these squares before our rook pawn gets there. And it comes in really handy to know this. But thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.